I would like you to all welcome Stavros Nicolaou, who is actually a leader within Aspen Pharma and has been in the forefront of having Johnson and Johnson being made in Africa, being supplied to Africa, and he's definitely got a challenge in meeting some of the targets, but somebody needs to start and take the forefront. Stavros, I'm so glad you've joined us. All these numbers we heard from AstraZeneca, and now we've heard from Dr. Guel, where we want to go. So Stavros, take us through your thoughts, and thank you so much for joining us today. Where are we currently in? What do we need to do to reach 40% by the end of the year?
Dr. Amit and esteemed fellow panelists and all the colleagues and delegates to this important summit, good afternoon. I think we're all in relatively the same time zone. It's indeed a great pleasure to be with you again, Amit, and to engage in these all-important conversations for the continent. Let me preface what I'm going to say by adding two things that Dr. Ahmed said earlier. Right? The first is that there is no more important an economic policy for Africa or any other continent than to vaccinate significant swathes of our population as swiftly and as timelessly as possible. It is only if we achieve this that we will then be in a position to open up our economies, to reduce the economic hardship and distress that the continent is facing, but also more importantly in the context of the vaccine passport or certification, depending on which one you want to use. You can't use the two interchangeably, of course. It is important for Africa to not lag the rest of the world in terms of opening up for international trade. And also, investors will more than likely return their investment appetite to those geographies and or jurisdictions that are highly vaccinated. Now, we've heard from CDC today that our continent is lagging significantly. We're at the back of the queue. And your question is, how do we accelerate this? And is it even possible to get to 40%? Well, I think to answer your question and interrogate that a little more closely, there are three elements that need to be balanced out, and the stars need to align on all three of these elements if we are to succeed. So the first is, does the continent have sufficient supply of vaccines at this point in time? The second element is, does it have capacity to administer the vaccine? So this is rolling out the vaccine in practical terms. And then lastly, is there sufficient demand? Because one thing having supply and fixing that element, but if you don't have sufficient demand because there are anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitant people, or the vaccine literacy aspects have not been properly addressed, then you could find yourself at the other extreme of the continuum, where you have sufficient supply but not sufficient demand, right? So for me to answer your question, I mean, it's about the stars aligning on all three of those elements, right? I'm going to speak to the first element, which is supply. Now we know that, and Dr. Ahmed put up the numbers, they're very clear. We know that the world has administered 5.6 billion doses of COVID vaccine, and Africa has administered around 110, 120 million. So you can do the maths for yourself. We are lagging significantly behind, and part of that reason is that if you have your own capacity, it's been demonstrated no matter what continent you're in, and regardless of any solidarity discussions that we might have been having globally as a global village or global community, regardless of all of that, it hasn't worked out. The solidarity concept hasn't landed us the vaccines that we required. So there's only really one answer here for this pandemic and any future pandemic, is you need your own capability and your own capacity. We've also heard loud and clear that Africa only produces 1% or less of its own vaccines. That's generally speaking of all the vaccines. We also know that we import 99%. That is counterintuitive because not only does this continent, our continent, Africa, have the most disproportionate disease burden, it is also significantly underinvested and understated when it comes to administering vaccines. When you have the disproportionality of disease burden, it becomes critical that you have your own capacities on the continent to manage that situation. Security of supply becomes a cardinal factor, and there's only one way of ensuring security of supply. We've learned this not only with vaccines, but all other pharmaceutical products. You have to have your own local capacities. Where is Aspen in all of this equation? Aspen is Africa's largest pharmaceutical company. We are heavily invested in the continent and in the future of the continent. And no future can be envisaged unless we overcome this pandemic on the continent and globally. And no future can be envisaged if we continue to have this disproportionality of disease burden, which of course affects the economies, it affects the labor force, productivity, and all these other elements. So the agenda of localization takes on a new meaning. Not only is it economically important for the continent, but also it's an absolute requirement to turn the tide against this pandemic and future pandemics as well. Aspen has for some time had a vision of moving up the manufacturing value chain. If you spoke to many analysts and commentators a decade ago and you asked them, where do you see Aspen? They would have all probably said, we see Aspen as a company underpinned by a strong manufacturing base, an emerging geographic footprint, a global geographic footprint, and a company that's got strong multinational relationships. It was always our intention to move up the manufacturing value chain, which is in fact what we've done. And that's why we entered the foray of sterile capability, manufacturing sterile products, just a little over a decade ago. And it's something we've continued to invest in over time. So when we consummated our last investment, it was very much for Aspen to deliver anesthetics to the world, particularly general anesthetics out of Kabeja, formerly Port Elizabeth in South Africa. And we were very successful in doing that. And I've mentioned previously on one of your earlier editions, Amit, that it certainly turned the tables, and I don't mean this in any insensitive or glib manner whatsoever, but for the first time, when the first wave hit Europe, continental Europe in particular, it was heads of state of France, Spain, Italy that were phoning an African company, Aspen, to ask for muscle relaxants and general anesthetics required to ventilate patients in ICU settings. Usually it's Africa that is picking up the phone and going out with a begging bowl. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because Africa does have the capability. We've shown that. We want to see that, it's not every day that heads of state phone and call you and say, well, please, African company, please dispatch, several thousands of doses of general anesthetic and muscle relaxant. Our people are dying in ICU. So we definitely have the ability to do this. And we looked at this as Aspen at the start of the pandemic and said, well, if we're heavily invested in sterile capabilities, then surely we can allocate some of that capacity towards manufacturing vaccines. Okay, and manufacturing in this context means doing fill and finish, as we call it. Of course, Aspen has, as it's publicly stated, ambition to manufacture a diversity of vaccines, but also an ambition to become backwardly integrated into the all-important drug substance. So you're end-to-end a manufacturer there. So with this capacity
Yes.
that we've built on the continent, let me end off with a direct response, Dr. Amit. I think that we are going to run very close by the end of the year to making a significant contribution, albeit at a contract manufacturing level, for and on behalf of Johnson & Johnson, to make vaccines available to the African continent.
Sure.
We do need to balance that out, of course, with the capacity that exists. Mobile clinics, mass vaccination sites are immensely important. There are many lessons we've learned here in South Africa that we're happy to share with the continent. And of course, lastly, we should never underestimate the vaccine literacy and the demand generation. We need to create demand so
Correct.
that you don't lag supply against demand.
Demand.
So it's a tall order, Amit. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in the last 3.5 months, and this conversation today hopefully adds added momentum and stimulus to this all-important rollout of vaccines on our continent. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stavros. I have one question, Stavros, for you. You know, when Adar Poonawalla of SII spoke about the situation of Delta variant in India, India has a similar population to Africa. They completely transformed their strategy and said all vaccines to look after the people in India before we send it out. Now, obviously, the wave was quite high. Now, Ogwell has told us we have from 18,000, now 45,000 new cases every day. So this third wave is biting Africa. If we were to say that Aspen, largest pharmaceutical manufacturer in Africa, will not send any of the vaccines out of Africa until we have Africa in the situation, till we get the 3% up to 10, 20%, then later on we send it out. Would that be a ridiculous ask to disallow a single vaccine to leave South Africa and your factory to go outside Africa until Africa is safe?
So, Amit, firstly, I think the principle of looking after yourself first is a well-established principle around the world, right? We've seen that. And as I said rather cynically earlier that, when the pandemic broke in December 19, January 2020, I think we were all in that mode where we all got to stand together and help each other, right? The reality is very different. And it should be no different in Africa. So I agree with you. The only way that we're going to prevent vaccine hoarding, and I can't legitimately blame any continent or country for wanting to look after their own citizens first. And we must have exactly the same attitude here in Africa. So there are many ways of achieving this. I think the first step we need to do, and this is what Aspen is actively pursuing, we are having active conversations as I speak right now with Johnson & Johnson. And incidentally, Johnson & Johnson have been very good in capacitating the continent because they've in record time transferred technology for fill and finish, and they are now in a conversation to expand this to the next step, which is granting a license to Aspen, which means Aspen will own the intellectual property. We will be able to manufacture an African vaccine for Africa. So you will safeguard through a license your own continent's requirements. It's very different if you're a contract manufacturer. You have no control whatsoever as to the allocation and distribution of these vaccines. Yeah. So this important step of licensing is what will secure the continent, its future requirements before we export to anybody else. Of course, does the continent want to export? Once it's satisfied its own needs, of course it does want to export because that's what generates revenue for the continent. It provides jobs, and it allows you to expand your technologies and your capabilities.
Right. Very clear. I think licensing, I've learned so much. And I must thank you and your organization. You've been quite a champion in the forefront of the vaccine manufacturing. You are going to be a pillar on the new public health order. Stavros will be in touch. Thank you as always for your time. To you, your company, your colleagues, your team there. We will be in touch, and I will see you shortly on different forum. And I'm going to call you for the public health conference in December. So watch out for that space. let me now...
Thank you. It's always a great pleasure, and congratulations to you and your team for putting these important conversations together that move our continent forward.